I still think about her eyes. Not the battle, not the ships overhead, not the sound of Velthari war drums shaking the ground through 6 inches of reinforced boots. Not even the moment when I thought I was going to die on a planet I'd only heard about in a classified briefing 3 weeks before. No, I think about her eyes. Because I've seen a lot of things in my 11 years serving in the Coalition ground forces. I've seen men crack under pressure. I've seen aliens twice my height back down from a fight. I've seen a medic hold a soldier's hand for 40 minutes while that soldier described his daughter's birthday party in perfect detail, the whole time bleeding out from a wound that wasn't survivable. I've seen courage, I've seen cowardice. I've seen the whole messy spectrum of what living creatures do when they're scared and far from home. But I had never, not once, seen what she did. And I was the one who said it to her. I was the one who leaned down, close enough that she could hear me over the artillery, close enough to see the dust in her eyelashes, and whispered those 6 words. "There's water for only one of us." And she looked at me. And everything changed. Set up. Let me back up. Let me start from the beginning, because if I start from that moment, you won't understand it, and it needs to be understood. The planet was called Orith 9 by the Galactic Coalition Registry. The Velthari called it something that translated roughly to the wound that won't close, which should have told us something about what we were walking into. The locals, what few survived the first Velthari occupation, called it Duskmere. I don't know why. I asked a local woman once, a month after everything happened, and she just tapped the ground with 2 fingers and said nothing. I liked that answer, actually. Some places earn their names through silence. I arrived on Orith 9 aboard the CGFS Meridian Compact, a mid-range transport carrier that smelled permanently of recycled air, and whatever the kitchen was pretending was protein that week. 11 days in transit from the Halcyon Station hub. I spent most of those days sleeping, reading old field reports, or playing a card game called Collapse with Sergeant Reyes Domingo, who cheated so consistently and cheerfully that it had stopped being annoying and started being kind of a comfort. Reyes was from Bogota, originally. He joined the ground forces at 19, the same way most of us had, not because of patriotism exactly, but because the Coalition was paying, and Earth's economy had been doing that particular wobble where nothing collapsed but nothing improved, and the recruiter's office was air-conditioned. He was my squad partner, had been for 6 years. I should tell you about him properly, because he matters to this story. Reyes was about 5'9", stocky, with a jaw like a piece of construction equipment, and these small, careful eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He didn't talk much on the first day of anything, new deployment, new billet, new problem. He'd just watch. And then on the second day, he'd say exactly what was wrong with the situation in 2 sentences, and he'd be right. He was also, and I don't say this lightly, the best soldier I have ever personally witnessed. Not in the dramatic way, not in the charging toward gunfire way, though he'd done that too. In the quiet way, the way where he always knew where the exits were. The way where he never, not once, lost his water ration, even when we were in the field for 3 weeks straight. The way where he could look at a Velthari patrol formation and tell you within 10 seconds how many individuals were in it, which direction the commanding officer was positioned, and what their likely response time was. He was the kind of soldier that makes the people around him better by proximity. I was his spotter and comms officer. I handled the communication arrays, the translation software, the satellite uplinks. I was fluent in 3 Velthari dialects, which was why I'd been assigned to this particular theater. The Coalition needed people who could actually talk to the Velthari if the diplomatic windows opened, and those windows had a habit of appearing and disappearing in about 4 minutes, so you needed someone in the field who could step in without a translation lag. That was me. Maya Holt, First Specialist, Coalition Ground Forces, Communications and Translation Division. We landed on Orith 9 in the early morning local time, which meant a sky the color of an old bruise, purple and gray, and that particular yellow that looks like it's trying to be sunrise, but hasn't quite committed. The air was breathable but heavy, the way humid air is, not exactly wet, but you could feel it sitting against your skin. The temperature was about 42 degrees Celsius. That matters, remember that. Duskmere was a contested region, had been for 8 months. The Velthari had come through 14 months prior, claiming the planet under the expansion doctrine, which was the legal framework they used when they wanted something and didn't want to feel bad about taking it. The coalition had been slowly pushing back, working in coordination with the surviving Duskmere population, trying to establish a ceasefire line, and then eventually negotiate actual withdrawal. The Velthari, predictably, were not cooperating. Here's what you need to know about the Velthari if you've never encountered them. They are tall, not uniformly but on average about 7 to 8 feet. They have a bilateral symmetry that's similar enough to human that it reads as familiar, but the proportions are wrong: longer arms, shorter legs, a torso that looks slightly too deep, like there's extra something inside. Their skin is a dense, almost chitinous texture in varying shades of dark gray, sometimes with blue undertones, sometimes reddish. Their faces have no nose in the mammalian sense, just a set of nasal slits that open and close when they breathe, and you can hear it when they're exerting themselves or agitated, a kind of rhythmic flutter. They have eyes that see better than ours in the dark. They hear frequencies we can't. They are physically stronger than a human by a significant margin. The exact figure varies by individual, but coalition training materials said to assume 3 to 4 times human lifting capacity in an engagement scenario. They also, and this is critical, have a cultural framework around resource scarcity that is genuinely and completely different from ours. In Velthari society, resources are not shared, not because they're cruel exactly, though they can be, but because their evolutionary history is one of brutal, prolonged scarcity on their home world. Their entire social structure is built on the concept of Krethval, which translates inadequately as something between earned dominance and survival priority. The strongest, fastest, most capable individual in any group claims what they need. What's left goes to the next and down the line. This is not considered unfair. It is considered the natural order. Sharing resources voluntarily, in classical Velthari culture, reads as either weakness or deception. You share something because you're too weak to hold it, or because you're hoping for something in return that exceeds the value of what you gave. There is no Velthari word that directly maps to the human concept of generosity as a virtue. I had spent 6 months studying this before deployment. I could read their body language mostly. I could speak well enough to be understood. I knew enough to not make certain gestures in their presence, to not position myself in ways that read as either challenge or submission, to keep my voice in the lower register when I wanted to be taken seriously. What I had never experienced before Oreth 9 was being completely alone in a collapsed building with a Velthari soldier and 1 canteen of water. The first 3 weeks on Oreth 9 were not the story. They were the context, the groundwork, the part that feels slow in retrospect but felt necessary in the moment. We were stationed at Forward Operating Base Harrow, which was really just a cluster of prefabricated coalition structures in what had been the industrial quarter of the largest Duskmere settlement, a city called Vass. The Velthari had bombed the city fairly systematically in the first week of the occupation, not trying to destroy it, exactly, more like trying to make it legible to them. Clear the clutter of local architecture, establish sightlines, make it feel like their kind of space. What it looked like to us was ruins. Vass had been a city of maybe 60,000. Maybe 40,000 had survived the initial occupation, and a lot of those had dispersed to smaller settlements in the surrounding terrain. The people still in Vass when we arrived were mostly the ones who couldn't leave: elderly, injured, those with young children, those with nowhere else to go. We worked with them. That was the part of the deployment that I don't think the briefings prepared any of us for. Not the combat readiness side, we were ready for that. Not the translation and negotiation work, I'd done versions of that before. But the part where you're in a partially collapsed market stall, helping a Duskmere woman stack salvaged goods back onto a shelf that's listing about 15 degrees to the left, and she starts talking to you in her language, which your translation device catches well enough but not perfectly, and you realize she's telling you about her husband, who was killed in the second week of the occupation, and she's not crying, she's just talking. The way you talk about something that happened when talking about it is all that's left. That part, nobody briefed us on that. Her name was Sela. She was maybe 50, though it was hard to tell. Duskmere physiology aged differently, and the occupation had probably compressed a decade of stress into 14 months. She was small, compact, with the characteristic blue-gray skin tone of Duskmere people and the lateral brow ridges that were a species marker. She had a way of looking at you directly and not flinching, which some of the other soldiers found unsettling, and I found I respected enormously. She was also, I learned over the course of 3 weeks, one of the remaining council members of the Duskmere community in Vass, which made her important to our operation. And she was the reason I was in the building when it collapsed. Let me give you the tactical picture briefly, because it matters for understanding the geography of what happened. The Velthari had been pressing from the northeastern sector of Vass for about a week. We'd been holding a ceasefire line at what the field maps called the Bracket, a curve of intact buildings along the old commercial district. It was a decent defensive position. Clear fields of view, enough cover, good structural integrity on most of the buildings. On day 22, they pushed. Not a full engagement. The Velthari weren't trying to retake the whole city, not that day. It read like a probe. 2 or 3 units testing the Bracket's weak points, seeing how we'd respond, maybe trying to draw our forces in a particular direction. The problem was, their probe aligned with a section of the Bracket where Sela had a contact, another council member, an older man named Drev, who had barricaded himself inside a building on the eastern edge because he hadn't believed the ceasefire line would hold, and he wanted to be close to the underground access point his community had used during the worst months of the occupation. She wanted to get to him. She was going to go alone. Reyes was coordinating the defense response. He needed me on comms, and I told him I had to run an extraction first, and I told him where, and he looked at me for exactly 1 second with those small, careful eyes and said, 20 minutes. That was Reyes for be back in 20 minutes, or I will personally come and find you, and it will be unpleasant for everyone. I said, copy. Sela and I moved through the back passages, the long way around the Bracket, using a route she knew, and I'd mapped on my 3rd day in Vass when I'd done a full structural survey of the sector. It added 4 minutes but kept us out of Velthari sightlines. The building where Drev had been staying was a 3-story commercial structure. Old, prefabricated shell, thick walls, mostly intact roof. It had a ground floor that had been some kind of materials warehouse, based on the shelving still along the walls. The upper floors were residential conversion, common in Vass, commercial below, living space above. We got there, we found Drev. He was alive, irritable, and carrying approximately 40 kilograms of personal belongings that he was absolutely not leaving behind. Sela started talking to him in rapid-fire Duskmere that my translator couldn't keep up with. I gave them 90 seconds, and then said, quietly but clearly, that we needed to leave. That was when the artillery round hit. Not on our building, 3 buildings east, but the shockwave in this part of Vass, with the amount of structural compromise already present, was like pressing your thumb down on a line of dominoes. I heard the groan first. Buildings make a sound right before structural failure, not in the walls, but in the connections, the joints, the places where different pieces of the structure are holding each other up. It's a deep sound, like something enormous clearing its throat. I grabbed Sela's arm. She grabbed Drev. We moved toward the ground floor exit. We made it down the stairwell. We did not make it out the door. The front section of the roof came down in pieces, not all at once, which is actually more dangerous, because the first collapse destabilizes the rest, and then you're standing there waiting for the next thing to fall. The exit on the south side was blocked within 4 seconds. The east exit, a side door, was blocked by a secondary fall maybe 10 seconds later. Dust. So much dust. And then sound. Not more falling, something else. Movement. I had my sidearm out before I'd consciously made the decision to draw it. Sela had pressed herself and Drev against the back wall of the ground floor, behind a section of shelving that was still standing. I was in the center of the space, crouched, trying to see through the dust. The sound was coming from the collapsed section, near what had been the front entrance. Something large was moving through the rubble. I clicked my comm unit. Static. The antenna array on my back was damaged. I could feel it. The unit was running a diagnostic and showing me red indicators across the board. I was not going to reach Reyes. The movement stopped, and then a section of debris shifted, and a Velthari soldier pulled himself out of the rubble. He was large, even by Velthari standards, maybe 7.5 feet. His armor was in bad shape. The chest section was partially caved in, which told me the collapse had caught him mid-entry, probably trying to use the building as cover when the rounds started falling. He was bleeding from 2 wounds that I could see, one on the upper arm, one along the left side of his face, where a piece of shrapnel or debris had cut deep. He was also armed. A Velthari pulse rifle, a heavy frame weapon which he had managed to keep hold of somehow through the collapse. He straightened up and he saw me. We stood there, the dust settling around us, the sound of artillery somewhere far enough away to not be immediate, the light coming in through cracked sections of ceiling, dropping these long diagonal shafts through the particulate in the air. His nasal slits were working fast, agitation or pain or both. His eyes, Velthari eyes are a deep amber, almost orange, with a slit pupil, were fixed on me with an intensity I had learned, over months of study, meant active threat assessment. He was deciding. I did not move. I kept my sidearm visible but angled down. Not a challenge, not a submission, just presence. I said in Velthari as steadily as I could manage, neither of us chose this room. It's a phrase from Velthari tactical culture. It means something like we are not enemies in this moment, we are survivors in the same space. It doesn't mean peace, exactly. It means suspension. It's used between Velthari soldiers of opposing factions when they end up in the same impossible situation. I was not Velthari, I was not their opposing faction. But I knew the phrase and I said it right, and his threat posture shifted. Just slightly, the barrel of his rifle moved maybe 3 degrees to the left. I breathed. His name, what I could render of it in my head, because Velthari names have a tonal component that human vocal cords can't fully replicate, was something like Vrash. I'll call him Vrash. He was injured significantly. The wound on his side was worse than I'd initially assessed. When he moved, I could see a dark stain spreading through the break in his armor, and the way he was holding himself told me he'd cracked at least one structural rib equivalent on his left side. Velthari physiology is robust, but not invincible. And under 42-degree heat, with a wound that was seeping fluid, and whatever physical stress the collapse had already put on him. He needed medical attention, which we did not have. What we had in that room was the following: my field kit, trauma dressings, coagulation gel, a minor analgesic applicator, a thermal overlay, a small atmospheric filter mask, 3 ration packs, my sidearm with 11 rounds, a broken comms array. Sela's bag, Duskmere medical herbs she'd been carrying for Drev, some dried food, a thermal blanket, a personal communicator that was also showing damage indicators. Drev's 40 kilograms of personal belongings, which turned out to be mostly records, physical data tablets, old documents, things he'd been safeguarding, nothing useful for survival. I privately revised my earlier irritation at him into something more complicated. And 1 canteen. 1 full canteen of water. Approximately 750 milliliters. In 42-degree heat. With 4 living beings in a sealed, partially collapsed space. One of whom was a 7.5-foot Velthari soldier who was bleeding, in pain, and operating from a cultural framework that said the strongest individual in the room got the resources first. Build tension. The first hour was negotiation. Not verbal, we didn't do much talking in that first hour. It was positional, spatial. The Velthari equivalent of 2 people deciding where they're going to sit in a room together. Vrash moved to the far corner. He did not lie down. Lying down is a vulnerability posture in Velthari culture, and even wounded, he wasn't going there. He sat in a way that was clearly painful, his left side angled away, his weight shifted, but he was upright, which I understood. Sela and Drev stayed behind the shelving. I stayed in the center of the room, which was intentional. I was the translator, the point of interface. Being in the middle was structurally correct for that role. I opened my field kit. I started preparing a trauma dressing. Vrash watched me. I said in Velthari without looking directly at him. Direct eye contact in early tension situations reads as challenge. Your wound is open. The heat will make it worse. Nothing. I laid out the dressing materials on a flat piece of debris in front of me. Organized, visible, then I stepped back. I waited. It took about 6 minutes. Then he made a sound, low, clipped, that meant roughly continue. I approached slowly. I kept my movements deliberate and visible, no sudden angles. When I got close enough to work, I crouched to reduce my height differential, which is considered a gesture of non-aggression in Velthari spatial logic. You're not trying to match their height, You're making yourself smaller, acknowledging the physical hierarchy without challenging it. His wounds were bad, but not immediately lethal. The facial laceration needed pressure and would probably scar deeply. The arm wound was through and through, something had gone in and come out, which was both good and bad. Good because there was nothing to extract, bad because the exit wound was ragged. The side wound was the problem. A piece of structural material, looked like a fragment of metal beam, had gone through the gap in his chest armor and into the soft tissue below the first rib section. It wasn't deep enough to have hit anything critical, I thought, but it was deep enough to be serious, and it was actively bleeding. I applied the coagulation gel. I could feel him tense under my hands, that full-body rigidity that's a pain response across most species. He made no sound. I said, still in Velthari, "Hold pressure here," and I guided his own hand to the dressing. He held it. I sat back. We looked at each other. And I saw, just briefly, just a flicker, something that I hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not quite. Something more complicated, like he was recalculating something. The second hour was harder. The temperature in the room was rising. The building had been insulated enough to stay somewhat cooler than outside during the day, but the collapse had compromised that, and the afternoon was coming on, and it was getting hot. Real aggressive heat, the kind that sits in your lungs. Drev was not doing well. He was older, and the physical and emotional stress of the collapse had hit him hard. He was sitting against the wall with his eyes partially closed, and his breathing was shallow. Sela was monitoring him with quiet, focused attention. I watched the canteen. I had kept it in my field pack, visible if you knew to look but not displayed, not yet. I ran the math in my head, and I kept running it. 750 milliliters, 4 individuals, 2 human-adjacent, 1 Duskmere elderly, 1 injured Velthari. Vrash's mass was probably 4 times mine. His fluid requirements in this heat, especially with a bleeding wound, were significant, substantially more than mine. Drev was elderly, injured by stress, and Duskmere physiology had different hydration curves than human. Sela had told me, in one of our early conversations, that Duskmere could tolerate dehydration slightly better than humans because of a biological adaptation related to their planet's seasonal water scarcity. Not dramatically better, but somewhat. I was fit, relatively young, running at approximately normal stress levels given the circumstances. I could manage without water longer than Drev, maybe longer than Sela. But not as long as I'd need to, if we didn't get out in a reasonable time. And Vrash needed water or he was going to deteriorate, fast. The military math in my head said, he's the enemy. He's armed. He's physically dominant in this space. If he deteriorates significantly, the threat level drops. I sat with that thought for a moment. Then I acknowledged it and set it aside, because it was the kind of thought that, if you followed it, turned you into someone you didn't recognize afterward. I'd seen soldiers follow that kind of thought. I'd watched what happened to them in the months after, the way they went quiet in certain conversations, the way their eyes did something when particular memories surfaced. I wasn't going to go there, but I still had a problem. 750 milliliters, 4 beings, and the canteen was mine, technically. I was the one who'd filled it that morning from the purified reserve at Fob Harrow. I was the one who'd been carrying it. And in Velthari culture, the resource belonged to the one who held it. Which meant if I gave water to Vrash, I was not doing what he expected. I was not being weak, exactly, because I was the one making the decision. But I was doing something that didn't map onto his cultural framework neatly. I was going to have to explain it. And in explaining it, I might change something. Or I might not. He might just take the canteen once he knew it existed. I kept thinking. It was Sela who surfaced the problem eventually. She came to where I was sitting and crouched beside me, and spoke very quietly. Her Duskmere was slow and careful because she knew my translation device was damaged, and I was working with about 70% comprehension on a good day now. She said, and I'm paraphrasing because the translation was partial, that Drev needed fluid. His lips were beginning to dry. He was sweating more than was healthy for his age. I nodded. She looked at the field pack. She was smart. She'd noticed the canteen. I said in the best Duskmere I could manage, I had maybe 20 words learned specifically for the deployment. I know, I'm deciding. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at Vrash in his corner. She said slowly, making sure I caught it, "He will not share, his kind do not share." I said, "I know." She said, "What will you do?" I looked at the canteen. I looked at Vrash. I looked at Drev, whose eyes were fully closed now, whose breathing was audible and irregular. I said, "I don't know yet." And that honestly was true. I did not know. I had a sense of what I was going to do, the direction of it, the basic shape, but the details, the how, I hadn't worked out. Because this was not just a survival problem. This was a first contact problem. Because if I did this right, if I handled the next 10 minutes correctly, it might mean something. It might mean something far beyond this room and this canteen, and these 4 people in this specific corner of a ruined city. And if I did it wrong, Vrash might just take the water and we might all die anyway. Only I'd have failed to do the thing correctly on top of it. Climax. I gave myself another 20 minutes. I spent them running translations in my head, pulling vocabulary and phrase structures I'd memorized, checking them against what I knew of Velthari emotional and social logic. Then I stood up. I crossed the room. Not all the way to Vrash's corner, I stopped about 6 feet from him, which in Velthari proximity norms was the zone between acknowledged presence and direct engagement. Close enough to talk without raising my voice, far enough to not be triggering. He tracked my movement. He was still holding pressure on the side wound. His coloring had shifted slightly. Velthari show physiological stress through a subtle change in skin tone, a deeper, less reflective gray. He was getting worse. I crouched down, which brought my eye level to approximately his chest height, still lower than him, which was intentional. I took the canteen out of my pack slowly. I held it visible. His eyes moved to it, a reflex. And then I said it quietly because the walls in a space like that have a way of making whispers carry, and I wanted it to be between us. I don't know why I whispered. It was just the right tone for what I was about to say. I said in Velthari as carefully and precisely as I could construct it. There is water for only one of us, one measure, one dose that makes a difference. I paused. By your law, by Krethval, I hold it and I am capable, so it is mine. No one in this room disputes that. Another pause. I am giving it to you. The silence was complete. Even the distant artillery had paused, in that particular way that artillery pauses sometimes, like the whole world had decided to take a breath. Vrash looked at me. The amber eyes, the slit pupils, and behind them, something I couldn't name. Not in Velthari terms, not in human terms. Something that seemed to exist in the space between our 2 very different histories of being alive. I said, not because I am weak, not because I want something in return, because you are injured and I am not, and that changes the calculation. I set the canteen down on the floor in front of me, not handed to him, placed between us in the neutral zone. This is not Krethval, I said. This is something else. My people have a word for it. You don't have this word. Maybe after today you will. His nasal slits were very still. I said it is called giving. And I said the English word, giving, because there was no Velthari equivalent and I wanted him to have the foreignness of it, the sense that this was from another place, another way of being. I waited. He looked at the canteen. He looked at me. He looked at Sela and Drev against the wall. He ran through something behind his eyes. I could almost see the processing, the recalibration. The trying to fit what I'd just done into a framework he had and finding it didn't fit cleanly. And then he said in Velthari, low and deliberate, "Why?" Not a question, a demand. A Velthari demand for explanation, which is actually a form of respect. If he didn't think I was worth understanding, he wouldn't ask. I said, because in my culture, the measure of capability is not what you take. It is what you can afford to give. I watched that land. I watched him absorb it. And then, this is the part I can barely explain, even now, to people who weren't there. He reached forward, not to the canteen, to me. He placed one hand, palm flat, against the side of my face. It's a Velthari gesture that doesn't map neatly, but the closest translation is, I am acknowledging your existence as significant. It's used in Velthari culture between individuals of very different status, higher ranking to lower, usually in moments of recognition. He had never, in any framework his culture gave him, done this to a human. His hand was warm, bigger than my whole face. The texture of his skin was not what I expected, not rough, not hard, but something like dry leather that had been kept very well. He held it there for maybe 3 seconds. Then he released. He picked up the canteen. He drank exactly half. He sealed it. He held it out to me. I stared at it. He said in slow, deliberate Velthari that I could follow even with my damaged translation software. You said there is only one of us for this water, but there are 4 of us in this room. I am calculating differently now. And his face, as much as I could read Velthari facial expression, did something that might have been, if the universe was feeling generous, a kind of smile. I took the canteen. I crossed to Sela. I gave half of what remained to Drev first, carefully, helping the old man drink in small sips. He opened his eyes. He managed to swallow. The effect was not magical. He was still unwell, but the quality of his breathing changed almost immediately. The body does that. It knows when it's getting something it needed. Then I gave the remaining quarter to Sela. She took 1 sip and tried to give it back. I said in my limited Duskmere, all of it, for you. She looked at me with an expression I will keep with me for the rest of my life. She drank. I held an empty canteen. And I wasn't afraid. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel the fear of having nothing left. But all I felt was clear, like something complicated had simplified. We were in that room for another 4 hours. Those 4 hours are a different kind of story, and I'll tell them quickly because the shape of them matters, but the details are secondary to what had already happened. Vrash's condition stabilized. The coagulation gel did its job and the fluid helped, and the temperature inside the building actually dropped slightly as the sun moved and the afternoon heat peaked and began to recede. He was not comfortable, but he was not deteriorating. Drev rallied enough to be alert, though weak. Sela sat with him and they spoke quietly. I caught fragments. He was telling her about the records he'd been keeping. The names of everyone who'd been in Vass when the Velthari came. Every name. 40,000 names, approximately, on those data tablets in his 40 kilograms of personal belongings. I understood, then, why he'd refused to leave without them. Vrash and I talked. This was the strangest part, and also the part that I've gone back to more than any other. We talked. Not military intelligence. We were both careful about that, almost by implicit agreement. Not tactics, not positions, not the strategic situation. We talked about water. He told me, and this took patience and partial translation, and a lot of gaps that I filled in later after, when I had time to review my recorded audio against better software. He told me about his home world. About the Velthari home world, Vel Prime, which I'd read about in briefings but never heard described from inside. He said the water there came from deep below the surface, that it had to be brought up, and that bringing it up was the work of the strongest members of any clan group, and that when it arrived in limited measure, and the allocation of it was the first and most fundamental expression of social order. He said the strongest drank first because if the strongest died, no one could bring more water. He said this was not cruelty. He said, and this is the line I keep coming back to, he said, we built our world around scarcity because scarcity built our world. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told him about Earth, about rivers, about rain, about the ocean, which I don't think fully translated. The Velthari have no equivalent. Their planet's water is subsurface, and the concept of an entire body of water sitting open on the surface of the world, under the sky, visible and accessible. I watched him process it, the amber eyes going somewhere internal. He said slowly, your people have always had enough. I said, not always, and not everyone, but more than you, yes. He said, and yet you still fight each other. I said, yes, we do. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, perhaps scarcity is not the problem. I looked at him. He said, perhaps we have carried the habit of scarcity past the point where the scarcity is real. I had no answer for that, because it was true of both our species, just in different directions. The rescue came at hour 4. Raised, of course it was Rays. He came through the south wall, not the collapsed entrance. the wall itself, with a structural cutting tool and 2 other soldiers and a medic. He'd spent the 4 hours coordinating the defense, stabilizing the bracket, and simultaneously running a locator trace on my comm unit's emergency beacon, which had been too damaged to transmit, but still had enough residual signature for the right kind of equipment to find. He came through the wall and he stopped. He saw Vrash. His hand moved to his weapon. I said, "Stand down, Sergeant." He looked at me. I said, "He's wounded. He needs medical attention." He cooperated. Raises 2 seconds of assessment, those small, careful eyes. He said, "Copy." His hand moved away from his weapon. He looked at Vrash with a kind of open, measuring attention that I don't think many Velthari had ever received from a human soldier, and said, mostly to me, but loud enough for the room, "The medic can look at him if he'll accept it." I translated. Vrash made the low, clipped sound that meant continue. Getting all 4 of us out took another hour. The medic stabilized Vrash's wounds well enough for him to be mobile. Drev required a stretcher. Reyes had brought one because Reyes was Reyes. Sela walked out under her own power, carrying the 40 kilograms of data tablets herself, refusing help, and she did it like it weighed nothing. The question of what happened to Vrash was complicated and above my pay grade. He was technically a prisoner of the Coalition. He didn't resist that designation. When I explained it to him, he said in Velthari, "I am the only one of my unit who survived. There is nothing to return to today. Your medic's work was well done. I will accept your custody until circumstances change." Which was, as Velthari prisoner statements went, extremely cooperative. He was transported to the Coalition medical facility at Harrow. He was treated. He was housed, separately from other prisoners, because he'd asked for it, and the command had decided that accommodating him was worth the administrative complexity. Over the next 6 weeks, he became the first Velthari military individual in the history of Coalition Velthari engagement to voluntarily provide strategic information about Velthari internal politics. Not military positions, he kept that back. But the politics, the internal debates within the Velthari command structure, the factions who were beginning to question the expansion doctrine. He said, when he began talking, that he was talking because of what I had said in the room. He said, "I carried the habit of scarcity past the point where the scarcity was real. I am choosing to examine that." I was in the room when he said it. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Resolution. The ceasefire in Duskmere came 11 weeks after that day. It wasn't because of 1 room and 1 canteen and 4 people. That would be too neat. History doesn't work like that. The ceasefire came because of 100 things, the way outcomes always do: military pressure, diplomatic work, economic realities on the Velthari side, the growing political movement among Velthari internal factions who were calling the expansion doctrine into question. But, in the ceasefire negotiations, the lead Velthari diplomatic delegate introduced a new phrase into the proceedings, a phrase that had never appeared in any Velthari diplomatic communication before. The translator flagged it as anomalous, no match in the database. I was in the observation room. I heard it. I knew what it was immediately. It was an attempt, partial, slightly grammatically incorrect, clearly translated back into Velthari from a foreign concept, to render the word giving into their language. They'd made a word for it. I cried, sitting in that observation room. I am not embarrassed about that. I cry sometimes when the world does something it wasn't supposed to be able to do. Reyes was sitting next to me. He saw, he didn't say anything. He just put his hand on my shoulder and left it there. That was Reyes. Sela stayed in Vass. The reconstruction of the city took years. It's still ongoing, as far as I know, though I've been reassigned twice since then, and I follow the news when I can. Drev's data tablets were authenticated and integrated into the Duskmere Cultural Archive. The names on them, all 40,000, were read aloud at a ceremony held in the central square of Vass on the 1st anniversary of the ceasefire. The reading took 6 hours. I watched footage of it later from a different posting, in a small room by myself, on a screen that was too small for what I was watching. Vrash, I don't know where he is now. He was released into Velthari jurisdiction as part of the diplomatic agreements. I got one communication from him afterward through formal coalition channels. It was brief. It said in Velthari, "I recalculated. It is still ongoing. I thought you should know." I wrote back, "I'm not sure my message arrived. The channels were uncertain at that point." "I hope it did." I was debriefed extensively about the room, about the conversation, about what I'd said and how and in what order. There was a woman in the debrief room, a senior diplomatic analyst, who kept asking me why I'd given away the water. Not accusatorially, genuinely, she was trying to understand. I kept trying to explain it. I said, because I ran the math, and he needed it more. She said, "But you couldn't know that. You couldn't know what he'd do." I said, "No, I couldn't." She said, "So why?" I said, "Because I looked at him, and I saw a living being that was suffering. And I had something that could help. And the fact that he was my enemy, the fact that his entire cultural framework said I should be afraid of him, and he should be indifferent to me, that was all real. But it wasn't more real than what I could see right in front of me." She wrote that down. She looked up. She said, "And her reaction, when you gave him the water, what did she do?" She meant Sela. I thought about it. I had been so focused on Vrash, on the risk, on the translation, on getting it right, that I hadn't been fully attending to Sela's reaction in the moment. But I remembered it, because it was the last thing I'd expected. She hadn't looked surprised. I'd expected surprise. I'd expected the kind of reaction you have when someone does something you couldn't have predicted, but Sela hadn't looked surprised. She'd looked relieved, like she'd been waiting for something, like she'd looked at me and made a calculation of her own in those first hours in the room, and the calculation had been, is this human going to be what I think she is, or is she going to be something else? And when I gave the water to Vrash, she'd gotten her answer. She looked at me afterward, when I crossed to give the remaining water to Drev, and she said something in Duskmere that my translation device caught clearly, because it was a short, simple phrase. She said, "I thought so." Just that. I thought so. And I didn't know until later, much later, in the debrief when the diplomatic analyst explained Duskmere cultural context, I hadn't known, that the phrase in Duskmere carries a meaning that's more specific than the English equivalent. It means, "I saw this in you before you did it, and I am glad to have been right." She'd seen it in me, before I'd done it. She'd been watching me those 3 weeks, working alongside me, counting the small things, and she'd made a judgment. And when the moment came, she wasn't surprised. The full story, second wave. I want to keep going because the story doesn't end with rescue. The story ends with what came after, and what came after is actually the larger part of it. I stayed on Orith 9 for 8 more months after the building collapsed. This is the part I haven't talked about much, in the formal debriefs or the informal conversations over mess tables with people who'd heard fragments of the story. People heard about the canteen. People heard about the Velthari soldier who gave back half the water. That part made the rounds. It's a good story, clean and quotable, and the coalition communications people liked it for morale purposes. What they didn't hear about as much was the 8 months. The 8 months were the real education. After the ceasefire, the working ceasefire, not the formal one, the kind that happens before the paperwork and has to be managed hour by hour, my role changed. I was still comms and translation, but I was also, increasingly, something else, something that didn't have a formal job title in the coalition roster. The Duskmere community in Vass started calling me Vethala, which translated as something like the one who speaks both ways. Not just linguistically. They meant it more broadly. They meant someone who could hold 2 frameworks at once without collapsing into either. It was the highest compliment I'd been given in my professional life, and it wasn't in my file anywhere. Sela was responsible for a lot of it. She started including me in community meetings, not as a coalition representative, not officially. Unofficially. She'd tell me the evening before that there was a meeting and I could come if I wanted to. I always came. The meetings were in a basement space under what had been the Vass community hall. The hall itself was ruined, but the basement was intact, low-ceilinged, smelling of stone, and the particular oils the Duskmere burned in their small, portable heaters. It held maybe 40 people sitting close together, and the conversation went around the room in a way that had a structure I gradually came to understand, where the eldest spoke first, and then the speaking moved through age brackets, and the youngest voices came last but were given extra time. I sat in the corner with my translation device, repaired now, running at full capacity, and I listened. I learned things in those meetings that weren't in any coalition briefing document. I learned that the Duskmere had a concept of territorial belonging that was fundamentally relational. The land belonged to the relationship between the people and the land, not to the people alone. When the Velthari claimed Orith 9 under the expansion doctrine, the Duskmere's primary objection was not the displacement, devastating as that was. Their primary objection was to the conceptual framework itself, the idea that any entity could own a planet, that this was a kind of category error. I learned that the Duskmere had survived a previous occupation, 200 years prior, by a different species that had since become coalition members in good standing. This occupation had lasted 80 years. The Duskmere had done what they always did, what Sella would describe with a phrase that translated as the patience that is not passive. They had continued existing, continued recording, continued maintaining their cultural infrastructure below the surface of the occupation, and when the occupiers eventually left, the Duskmere had simply continued. I learned that Drev's data tablets were not a unique project. He had been one of 15 council members running parallel archiving efforts across different parts of Vass and the surrounding region. The coalition had one occupation record. The Duskmere had 15 redundant copies. I thought about that a lot. Reyes and I spent a lot of evenings during those 8 months, sitting outside whatever our current billet was. It changed 3 times as the stabilization lines shifted, watching the local sky get dark. Orith 9's sky at night was extraordinary. 2 moons, one large and close, one small and distant, and the planetary ring system visible in the southern quadrant of the sky as a wide pale band. The stars were wrong, not the constellations I'd grown up with, not Orion or the Dipper, just a field of alien arrangements that I'd learned the coalition navigation names for but couldn't make feel like mine. Reyes said one evening that he missed being able to find the Southern Cross. I said I missed Orion. He said, which star? I said Betelgeuse, just because it's embarrassing to say out loud. He laughed. Reyes had a laugh that was completely disproportionate to his physical presence. Big, rolling, surprised-sounding, like he was always slightly astonished that something was funny. We talked about the room once, just once. Reyes wasn't a person who revisited things verbally. He processed privately and emerged with conclusions, not process. But one evening he said, not quite looking at me, that he'd been thinking about the water. I said, yeah. He said, I've been trying to figure out if it was brave or just not knowing any better. I said, those aren't mutually exclusive. He was quiet for a while. He said, what made you trust that he wouldn't just take it, once he knew you had it? I said, I didn't trust that. I didn't know what he'd do. He said, so you just did it anyway. I said, I did it because it was right. What happened afterward was, I tried to find the words. Afterward was his choice. I couldn't control that. All I could control was whether I did the right thing going in. Reyes was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I would have held the canteen. I didn't say anything. He said, I'm not sure that's wrong tactically, but I waited. He said, I keep thinking about the kid. The kid was a Duskmere child, maybe 10 years old, who had appeared at Fob Harrow about a week after the collapse, holding a handmade object. It looked like a small woven ring, made of some local plant material, and looking for me specifically by description. Sella had sent him. The object was a Duskmere gift token. I'd learned what they were by then. They were given when someone wanted to mark a moment that they considered part of their community's story. The kid had delivered it with great solemnity, and then turned and sprinted back into the ruins before I could say anything. Reyes had seen it happen. He'd said nothing at the time. Now he said, that kid's going to grow up. He's going to tell people about whoever that token came from, and the story he tells is going to be different because of what you did in that room, even if he doesn't know the details. I said maybe. He said definitely. He wasn't wrong. I knew it even as he said it. Stories are how species make sense of themselves, and this story, the one that started with a canteen and a Velthari soldier and 6 words whispered in a collapsed building, was going to be one of those stories. Not because it was dramatic, because it clarified something. The formal ceasefire negotiations started in month 5 of my extended deployment. I was part of the coalition translation team, not leading, but one of 4 specialists assigned to the Velthari Channel. The negotiations were held in a neutral orbital station, a coalition facility that had been retrofitted for multispecies diplomatic work. Long tables. Filtered air adjusted for 3 different atmospheric preferences. Translators wearing earpieces and trying to catch nuance across languages that had evolved on opposite sides of the galaxy. I watched the Velthari delegation arrive. There were 9 of them, all military, all senior. The lead delegate was a woman. Velthari don't distinguish gender the way humans do, but the classification system the coalition used put her in the female analog, named Skarath, who had the bearing of someone who'd been in command positions for decades and had seen everything twice. She terrified everyone in the room except, I noticed, the Duskmere Observer delegation. The Duskmere sent 1 representative, just 1. They had declined, politely but absolutely, to send a full delegation, on the grounds that the ceasefire negotiations were about their planet but not their negotiation to run. Their representative was Sela. I looked at her across the room and she looked at me, and she made a small gesture with 2 fingers, tapping the air in front of her. The same gesture she'd made when I'd asked her why Duskmere was called Duskmere, and she'd touched the ground. I understood. She was saying this is exactly where we are, right here, pay attention. The negotiations took 11 days. The details are classified or diplomatic record or both, and I'm not going to go into what I can't go into. What I can tell you is that, on day 4, the Velthari delegation introduced the new phrase, the Velthari word that didn't have a direct translation, that had been constructed to carry the concept of voluntary giving without expectation of return. The coalition translation team flagged it as anomalous. I said quietly into my comm, I know what it is, stand by. And I translated it. And the room changed temperature. Not literally, but something shifted. I could feel it, the Duskmere observer sitting up slightly. The coalition lead negotiator looking across the table with new attention. The Velthari delegation watching the human and Duskmere faces for a response. Skarath, the Velthari lead, said something after the phrase that my colleague struggled with. She flagged me and I took the feed. Skarath said in slow, formal Velthari, we introduce this term into negotiation because a term must exist before a concept can be discussed. We are not yet certain we agree with the concept. We are certain it must be examined. I translated it exactly. The coalition lead negotiator, a woman named Diaz, whom I had enormous respect for, said, after a pause, that may be the most honest thing anyone has said in this room. Skarath, when she received the translation, made a sound that might have been the Velthari equivalent of a short, acknowledging laugh. They didn't agree on everything. They didn't agree on most things. 11 days of negotiation produced a ceasefire framework that had 17 points and approximately 40 asterisks on those 17 points. It was a beginning, not a resolution. But it was a beginning that had a new word in it. I went back to Vass for the last time, 2 days before my transport arrived. I went to say goodbye to Sela. It felt necessary, even though we'd been in the same diplomatic facility for the past 2 weeks and could have said whatever needed saying in that context. The context was wrong. Goodbye to Sela needed to happen in Vass, in the ruins that were beginning to have new shapes in them. Walls going up where walls had fallen, cleared streets, the smell of fresh cut material mixing with the old smoke and stone. She met me in the space where the community hall had been. The walls were cleared. Someone had started laying a new floor, a different material than the original, lighter colored, and I'd heard from a Duskmere worker that the plan was to build the new hall with the original footprint preserved in the floor so you could see where the old one had been. Not erasing it, incorporating it. I stood there and Sela stood across from me, and we were not people who had the language for a proper farewell. We had about 40 words of shared linguistic capacity and a year of shared context. I said in my limited Duskmere, thank you. She looked at me for a long moment. She said in careful English, I had not known she had any English, and she must have been practicing because it was clear and deliberate. Come back someday. I said, I'll try. She said, the place will know you when you do. That was the Duskmere concept she'd been translating, the idea that places recognize people who have been part of their story. Not mystically, practically. The stories persist, and the people who are in the stories persist in the stories, and when you return to a place whose story you're part of, you are recognized in that material sense. I thought about that all the way back to Fob Harrow. I thought about it on the transport. I think about it still. The larger story, what it meant. Now I want to tell you what happened after. After I got home, after the deployment ended, after I'd filed my reports and done my debriefs, and had the specific experience of being back on Earth, which is always stranger than people who haven't deployed understand. The way normal things look slightly unreal for a while, like you're seeing them from slightly outside. I was reassigned to a desk position at the Coalition Diplomatic Training Facility at Geneva Station, which is in low Earth orbit. It's a good posting, clean and climate-controlled and intellectually rigorous. I hated it for about 3 months. Then I started to see what I was doing there. They had me teaching. Specifically, they had me teaching the Linguistics and Cultural Framework module for diplomats and field personnel heading into Velthari-adjacent deployments, which I had expertise in, which was why I was there. But what I actually taught, over 3 years, went considerably beyond linguistics. I taught, and I'm aware this sounds abstract, I'm trying to make it concrete. I taught what I'd learned in that room. I taught that cultural frameworks are not walls. They're architectural structures, deeply functional, evolved over time for reasons that made sense, still structurally sound for a lot of purposes, but not immovable, not complete. Every framework has gaps, and the gaps are where contact happens. The Velthari had a gap where giving should have been, not because they were cruel or incomplete as a species, but because their history hadn't required them to develop it. You don't build the wing on the house you don't need. But the gap was there, and a human woman with a canteen in a collapsed building had found it. I also taught, and this is the part that the training program hadn't included before I got there, I taught that the exchange worked both ways. Because what Vrash had said to me about carrying the habit of scarcity past the point where the scarcity is real, that was true of humans too, in ways that I kept seeing the more I thought about it. We had enough water. We had enough, most of us, most of the time, to sustain life without the desperate calculus that had built the Velthari social hierarchy. But we still fought about water. We still let people die of thirst. We still built systems of distribution that reflected a scarcity psychology long after the material scarcity had, in principle, been solved. We'd built our world around plenty and still acted, often like scarcity was the fundamental truth. I'm not saying the Velthari had it right. Their system caused enormous suffering, including on Orith 9. I'm not romanticizing it. I'm saying that when Vrash said perhaps we have carried the habit of scarcity past the point where the scarcity is real, he was looking at his own species. And I was sitting there hearing it apply to mine. That's what contact is when it works. It's not one side learning from another. It's two frameworks making each other visible. I got a message in my second year at Geneva Station. It was from a coalition diplomatic attaché stationed in the Velthari Secondary Diplomatic Hub on Kemath 7. She said there was a Velthari public figure, a former military commander who had become a political figure in the reformist faction, who was giving speeches, and the speeches were getting attention. The speeches were about Kethgora, which the coalition translation team was rendering as gift culture, but which the attaché said didn't feel right. And could I listen to a recording and provide a more accurate translation? The name of the Velthari political figure was not given, coalition protocol, with sensitive diplomatic materials. But I listened to the recording. I knew the voice. I'd heard it in a collapsed building, speaking slowly and deliberately so that a human woman with damaged translation equipment could follow. I listened to the whole speech. It took 40 minutes. Vrash, and I was certain it was Vrash, the vocal patterns were distinctive even across a mediocre recording, was arguing, in the slow and careful way he had of constructing arguments, that the Velthari needed to reconsider the relationship between strength and resource allocation. Not abandon Krethval, not tear down their entire social structure, but reconsider. He said, and here is my translation, which I sent back to the attaché the same day. The measure of capability is not what you take. It is what you can afford to give. He was using my words. He'd kept them for 3 years, across a prisoner release and a return to his own society and a career shift into politics, and he was using them. I sat at my desk at Geneva Station, in low Earth orbit, looking at my screen, and I thought about a room full of dust and falling light. I thought about 6 words whispered. I thought about amber eyes recalculating. I typed back to the attaché, the most accurate translation of Kethgora is giving. It means the voluntary transfer of a resource from a position of strength without expectation of return. It is a new concept in Velthari social thought. Handle it carefully. I scented. Then I sat in my chair for a while. Outside the window of Geneva Station, the Earth was turning below me, doing that thing it does, blue and white and green, impossible and real, lit from the side by a star that we'd named and quantified and mapped the nuclear processes of, and still couldn't look at directly. I thought about rivers. I thought about rain. I thought about the ocean, and the words I'd used to describe it to a Velthari soldier who'd never had a concept for it. Epilogue SELAS answer. 5 years later, I went back. I'd been granted a leave posting attached to a coalition cultural exchange delegation visiting Orith 9 as part of the ongoing normalization process. The formal ceasefire had held. The reconstruction of Vass was substantially complete, though the scars were visible and intended to be. The Duskmere had made architectural decisions throughout the rebuilding to make the history legible, not to hide what had happened, to make it part of the city's texture. I recognized streets I'd memorized from field maps, now clean and in use. I recognized the bracket, the defensive line we'd held, which was now a public walkway, the buildings on either side restored, a long corridor of open storefronts and gathering spaces. The new community hall was standing. The preserved footprint of the old one was there in the floor, inlaid in a different material, darker. You could see exactly where the original walls had been. I stood in that floor for a while. Sela found me there. She was older, 5 years older, which showed, but she also seemed settled in a way that hadn't been available to her in the occupation and the ceasefire. Not relaxed, exactly. She was not a relaxed person, but located, like she knew precisely where she was and what she was doing there. She looked at me and she made the 2-finger gesture, touching the air. I said, "Yeah, here we are." She had improved her English considerably. She'd been working with the coalition cultural exchange programs and apparently had decided that direct communication was worth the investment. She said, "I have something to tell you." We sat in the new hall on the old footprint, and she told me. She told me that in the 5 years since the ceasefire, the Duskmere Council had been working on something they'd decided needed doing. They had been gathering testimony from every Duskmere community across Orith 9. From the survivors of the occupation, the displaced, the people who'd stayed, the people who'd come back, every community. And they were building, this was how she described it in careful English, they were building what she called the record of what was done to us and what we did anyway. Not a grievance document, not only that. A document that contained both, what was done, and what the Duskmere did in response. The things they preserved, the things they rebuilt, the decisions they made, the moments of courage and the moments of failure, all of it in detail. She said, and there is a section. She looked at me. A section about the humans who came. I waited. She said, not all of them, not the coalition as an institution, but specific humans who did specific things that the community decided should be in the record. I said, Sela. She said, you should know what we wrote. She handed me a tablet, Duskmere script, which I could not read directly, but she'd prepared a translation alongside it in English. The section was 4 paragraphs. The first described the collapse of the building, factually and precisely. The second described the 4 individuals in the room. The third described what happened with the water. The 4th paragraph was the one she wanted me to read. It said, the human woman gave what she had to the enemy of her people, not out of weakness, not out of calculation, but out of a recognition that suffering does not require political approval to be real. The Velthari soldier received the gift. He did not know what receiving a gift was. He learned in that moment. Both were changed. This is what we are preserving in this record, that it is possible to be changed. That the moment of encounter, if it is approached with honesty, can alter the trajectory of both parties. We preserve this not to celebrate the human woman, though she deserves celebration, but because our children will need to know that this is possible. That is the most important thing to know when you are a small people who will be encountered, again and again, by larger ones. That it is possible to be changed, that it is possible to change, that the encounter done rightly is not loss. It is addition. We saw this, we put it in the record. I couldn't speak for a moment. Sela was watching me with that expression, the one that wasn't surprised because she'd already seen what was going to happen. I said eventually, "Thank you." She said, "No, thank you is," she searched for words. "Thank you is a transaction, this is not a transaction." I said, "No." She said, "This is the record saying, you were here and it mattered, and we will tell our children." I looked at the 4 paragraphs on the tablet. I thought about Vrash in his corner, holding pressure on his wound, deciding. I thought about Drev's 40 kilograms of names. I thought about Reyes' hand on my shoulder in the observation room. I thought about a new word entering the Velthari language. I thought about the Earth from orbit, blue and white and green. I said, "Can I keep a copy of this?" She said, "We made one for you. We assumed you would want it." She handed me a second tablet. I held it. Ending line. I am a comms officer, a translator. I've spent my career in the space between languages, which is actually the space between ways of being, between one history and another, between one way of understanding the world and the next. People ask me sometimes what the most important skill in that work is. I tell them it's not vocabulary, it's not grammatical fluency. It's the ability to hold something in your hands, something you need, something that costs you and recognize clearly and without flinching whether someone else needs it more. And then do what that recognition requires, even when you don't know what will happen next. Especially then, because the moment you act from that recognition is the moment contact actually happens. Not when the ships dock, not when the delegates sit down across the table, not when the translation software loads up. In a room in the heat, in the dust. When there's water for only one of you. And you give it anyway. And everything slowly, for both of you, changes.